I'm Connor Ruebusch, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to Heavy Hands. I'm your host, Connor Ruebusch. Here with me is Patrick Wyman. And Pat, I didn't check before the show once again. How's the weather there in Hollywood land?
How hard is it for you to get on AccuWeather and check beforehand, dude?
I know.
How hard is that?
I don't know.
No, it is a lovely early fall day here, low 70s.
I was worrying that you, the person who lives in California, would have more complaints about the weather again. Always makes me feel good to know that someone who lives in one of the nicest places in the world also has bad weather.
Yeah. Oh, no, terrible right now. Like low 70s, wind is lightly blowing.
So low 70s. So sweater weather.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Terrible. I'm thinking of pulling out the boots. Like this is rough, man.
We're just gonna begin every episode from now on till the show's completion with just a brief bit of weather talk. It's very useful for people to know what the weather was like a few days before they listen to the episode. Call that.
Well, I think it's very important. You know, you gotta put your listeners in your frame of mind.
That's right. Yeah, Heavy Hands weather update. That way you know where we're coming from, how our mood is affected. We're not going to be talking about the weather today, but we are going to be talking about the kind of people who love to talk about the weather. Old men. The first portion of today's episode in particular is pretty much dedicated to old men who specialize in punching faces. We've got a lot of them fighting in the near future and some that just fought. Michael Bisping and Dan Henderson, obviously fighting for the middleweight championship of the world. No, that's not a practical joke. In case you forgot, Michael Bisping is the champion and Dan Henderson, his first challenger. Both guys past their physical primes in some respects. Both guys still very dangerous. In some ways better, in some ways worse. Probably the better is more on the side of Michael Bisping at this point than Dan Henderson. And then we've also got a guy like Vitor Belfort. Last week we had Nate Marquardt, who I think was kind of venturing into old man Dan Henderson territory and has now kind of found a knack as a really dangerous counterpuncher and knocked out Tandem McCrory. Sad to see McCrory with 2 straight losses in a row now in the UFC, both brutal knockouts actually. But it's also kind of nice to see Nate the Great still getting wins at a fairly high level. And so pretty much, let's talk about old dudes, Pat. Let's first talk about prime. People talk a lot about athletes in their prime, before their prime, past their prime. What does prime mean to you?
So I think that prime is the period of time before your physical gifts have started to drop off. Or drop off noticeably and dangerously.
To me, it's the ideal, not just physicality, but it's the ideal intersection of youthful vigor and veteran experience.
Yeah. So up until the point where, because as time goes on, you should be getting more skilled. As time goes on, past a certain point, you are getting less physically gifted. Like the years and years and years of doing god awful things to yourself in the gym and in the cage start to take a toll. The injuries pile up. You are less explosive. Your reflexes slow. All of those things come into play. Where that line intersects with the line of your increasing skill, you hope that there is enough of that there's enough space between the two that you can still be a productive fighter.
Yeah.
So.
And then for some guys, wouldn't you say there's maybe like the prime could be, say if we're looking at this is going to be terrible for a podcast, but I'm going to describe a graph. Say we're looking at a graph. We have 2 lines. The athleticism starts at a certain point and it goes gradually down from left to right. The experience starts at a low point and it goes gradually up from left to right. And where they meet, that's what we typically mean as the prime. But for certain fighters, you'd think that prime would actually be shuffled to the right a little bit. Maybe if that experience grade is steep enough, where the experience is still experience and skill, things that improve over time, are coming together quickly enough or balancing out enough that the loss of athleticism doesn't hurt the fighter as much as it might others. And I'm thinking, of course, about Michael Bisping in this respect, because personally, I think the Michael Bisping we're seeing now is past his physical prime. Probably doesn't have the same stamina that he used to. Doesn't seem to. And probably is going forward going to be a little more prone to injury. We've already had a few in recent years. But I think he is technically better than ever before by such a degree that I think he is the best Michael Bisping he's ever been.
Yeah, I agree with this. So I think that what we're seeing with Michael Bisping is actually a pretty I think in terms of the length of his career, maybe he's a little atypical, but I think for elite fighters, truly elite fighters, what we see from him is not necessarily abnormal. So I would make the argument that Anderson Silva's entire legendary run towards the end of his career happened after his physical prime was well over.
Yeah, and I
right?
think that's what I'm saying is that we might call that after a physical prime, but if you are a smart enough fighter, if you're a skilled enough fighter, then maybe your actual prime as a fighter happens well after the peak of physicality. It can.
I think it can. I don't think it necessarily does. I think that it depends a lot on the fighter himself, how he's been trained,
Sure.
And how he approaches his declining physicality, right? So I think that there are some fighters whose game is just so innately tied to their physical gifts that they can't, that when they start to decline, they can't do anything about it. So I think Melvin Gillard would be an example of that, right? Like Gillard was a guy who, as long as he was still in his prime physically, could mask his skill deficiencies, could mask a whole lot of things about his game. But the second he fell off even a little bit, like especially his ability to absorb damage, the whole edifice came tumbling down.
Sure. Or let's look at two guys like Anderson Silva. It never looked like he was being saved by his craft. It looked like the craft was still allowing him to have his way with fights, whereas like George St. Pierre in his last fight with Johnny Hendricks looked like he was saved by his craft. I think he was a little more dependent even than Anderson on his athleticism.
Yeah. I mean, I also think that there are a lot of other factors that go into that I think like welterweight is just such a deeper division, and GSP was fighting guys who were so much better relative to him than Anderson was. I don't think the skill gap was quite as
I think that's why GSP is far and away the best of all time. I know some people don't like to hear that, but
yeah, I don't disagree with that at all. I think based on everything that we've learned in the last few years, GSP has cemented himself in that position for me. But at any rate, what I'm getting at is so there's, I think a lot of fighters still continue to fight effectively past the point where their physical prime is over, but others don't. So I think Uriah Faber is another example of a veteran fighter who, even when he was a little bit past it physically, had so much craft and so much experience built up that he could continue to be highly effective even afterward.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is kind of a basic general point for all elite fighters, that if you're that good, you can mask the physical decline with skill improvements. And I think now with Dan Henderson, we are well past that point. But going back to look at how Henderson dealt with his physical decline tells us a lot about him as a fighter.
Yeah, absolutely. And why don't we get into it and talk about Dan, where he is now, and kind of the path of his career getting to this point. I don't think anyone would disagree that Dan is well past his best, whether you're talking physically or skill-wise. At a certain point, I think every fighter hits a drop-off where the skill, the level of physicality needed to make the skill improvements work is no longer there. You need a certain amount of speed or stamina or strength to actually take advantage of the gifts your experience has given you. And so, you just can't keep reaping the benefits of that experience and of no matter how smart you train. And I think Dan Henderson's at that point. I think I'll actually be writing about this week, but why don't we go back to understand where Dan is now? Why don't we go back to what I think was really his last great performance? And to me, that was the first fight with Shogun Rua at UFC 139. Perhaps not coincidentally, it was near the end of Dan's time using TRT, although he did have 2 losses in a row while using TRT, I believe. I don't think it was banned until 2014. And he actually suffered 3 losses in 2013. So we can't immediately just say, oh, Dan was great on TRT, and when it was banned, he started to suck. I think maybe there was just a point of diminishing returns in terms of experience. And you might even argue that the Shogun fight, as vicious and back and forth as it was, maybe took away the end of Dan's run at the top, because it was certainly the hardest fight that he had, quite possibly the hardest fight he'd ever had.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, and it was one of the hardest fights of that or any era.
Yeah.
I mean, like an incredible back and forth kind of brawl. So yeah, I do agree that that was the kind of last fight where Henderson's physicality was still imposing enough for his for all of his experience to tell. So
Yeah.
there are a few sequences that stand out in particular. The big one to me is right in the first round, the first big salvo, where Henderson lands a big punch, gets into the clinch, grabs a collar tie, lands 3 uppercuts and an overhand, and then backs off out of range and kind of staggers Shogun. Shogun kind of staggers back into the middle of the cage. Like everything about that sequence, from recognizing what he had in front of him, what Shogun's shell guard, kind of double forearm shell guard, allowed him to land, and the speed with which he did it. That was that intersection of skill and still present physicality right there,
Yeah.
because the decision making was so quick and recognizing exactly what the opportunity was and capitalizing so fast. That was everything that Prime Henderson, or that kind of late Prime Henderson did right.
Yeah, and that's the meaning of prime, I think, is that that's why I think Henderson was probably at peak physicality a few years before that, maybe around the time of his fight with Wanderlei Silva. The second fight with Wanderlei at Pride 33 maybe was when he looked at his best in terms of how quickly he could close the distance, and kind of turned into more of a stalker, more of a patient stalker after that. But in that fight, like you said, it was, he was still quick enough to take advantage of the opening when he saw it, but there were times earlier in his career where he might have seen those same openings, and or he might have been quick enough to take advantage of the same openings and not seen them well enough, not have expected them and anticipated them and known to pull the trigger. And then after that fight, he might have had the experience and he would have seen those openings coming, but not been quick enough to pull the trigger on them.
Yeah, and I think that right there, when we talk about declining physicality, is the quintessential issue. It's that you may see that the opportunities are there, but you can't take advantage of them. So
Sure.
This was really apparent to me when I was watching. It's funny given that they've fought 3 times. I was watching Vitor Belfort's last few fights, where that I think is how we finally know that Vitor has passed it, is because the opportunities are there. When Jacare was pressuring Vitor, there were opportunities for Vitor to get one of those salvos off, and he just couldn't do it.
Yeah.
Could not quite pull the trigger.
Didn't do it against Chris Weidman, and he did do it against Dan Henderson the second time they fought.
Exactly. So, which I think tells you a lot about where both guys kind of are at this point.
Yeah.
But so think about it in mathematical terms, right? That if you're a fighter like that, I mean, both guys are kind of quintessentially burst fighters. They're not going to go out there and consistently score points. They're looking for openings to land big fight-ending shots, land these big flurries, these big power bursts. And so if you depend on doing that, then that means that you depend on A, creating opportunities for yourself, and B, exploiting opportunities when you see them. Mm-hmm. As you get older, as you become less physical, A, you're going to have some problems creating those opportunities in the first place. So things like what Vitor was doing with moving his opponent's hands around with kicks to open up either his straight left or high kicks, what he was doing during his that run where he had 3 head kick finishes in a row.
Yeah.
Vitor not as able to do that anymore. Henderson not as able to use his jab or pressure movement or kicks as effectively as he used to. So you're going to miss out on opportunities in the first place. But the bigger issue is that just kind of mathematically, if you beforehand were able to pull the trigger on 3 out of every 4 openings that you saw, as your reflex is slow, maybe you can only pull the trigger 1 out of every 2 times or 1 out of every 3 times you see those openings.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the basic statistical math that expresses this physical decline. Like, you're less able to create opportunities and you're less able to take advantage of them when you do see them, because you're just a split second too slow.
Yeah, there have also been a number of adjustments throughout Dan Henderson's career in particular, though. I think to maybe account for the changing of his body, that he probably knew it was happening. And I wonder if maybe we're seeing another one right now, and that it will not ever be as effective as some of his earlier adjustments were, because, like I said, there is a point where you just can't overcome the diminishing physicality. But, okay, so let's go through them really quickly. We have, old school Dan Henderson is Decision Dan. He was not only called that by fans because he went to decision, but because he got a lot of decisions that people thought he didn't really deserve. Relied a lot on his wrestling, unsurprising, because he was an Olympic wrestler. And holy shit, man, he debuted in 97. That is madness. That is actually insane. I don't think that actually clicked in my head until I just looked at it on Wikipedia. And then I think we saw Dan Henderson finding openings on the ground and in scrambles a little more. That was around the time of probably his first big memorable knockout. Actually, the first knockout of his career was the one with Renzo Gracie. And that was the one where it was like Dan Henderson had a matchup where he was like, all right, you know what? I'm going to be better off here if I strike this guy who wants to grapple me. And I think that was the first transformation where we saw kind of a craftier Dan Henderson. He had enough high-level experience and had grown into enough of a striker that he knew he could crack, and he knew that he could catch people while they were trying to take him down if it wasn't optimal for him to be there. Then that kind of morphed into more of a one-note striker, and I think that probably happened around the time of probably centered on the Wanderlei Silva fight all the way up to maybe the time of the first Shogun fight, where we still have that scrambling ability, but Henderson is doing a lot more of setting up these big shots from distance, like he did against Bisping, like he did against Fei Zhao when he won the Strikeforce title, and like he did numerous times against Shogun in their first fight. Now, I think Dan Henderson has thoroughly learned that that is not possible anymore, that he cannot actually close that gap. As you said, Pat, he can't create those opportunities. And so I think in the past 3 fights, we have seen Dan Henderson come to terms with that fact and resolve himself to waiting for the opportunity and relying on the fact that if he's not exposing himself, he's not as much at risk as if he hangs back. And because he has all this experience to lean on, he can probably see when the other guy's vulnerable better than they can when they come forward. And so we've seen him counter knocking out Tim Boetsch, counter stunning Hector Lombard with a beautiful counter right hand, and then also doing some of that crazy scrambling stuff and trying to do the same stuff to Vitor Belfort. If you contrast their second fight, when Henderson rushed after Vitor and tried to close the distance, possibly trying to wrestle with him, possibly trying to launch that big right hand the way he did against Fei Zhao, and you contrast that with the third fight, there's a marked difference. The third fight, it didn't work for Dan. Vitor still got to him with the head kick, but it was definitely Dan chopping away with kicks, waiting for Vitor to lunge in, and waiting on that counter opportunity. Very similar to what Nate Marquardt has been doing lately, too.
Yeah, I think this is really common for fighters as they get older to become more and more reliant on the counter, because it's simply, more than anything else, because it plays off your inability to push the same kind of pace that you used to. It takes less energy. It's more efficient. And at that point, you're not as worried about scoring points anyway. You're more reliant on landing the knockout shot, and counters are the best way to do that. Yeah. Like, that's the story of the end of Anderson Silva's career.
Right.
Is increasing reliance on counter punches instead of leading the dance.
Even more notable example, I think, is Wanderlei Silva, because he was so aggressive early on and was really a counterpuncher for like the last 3, 4, 5 fights of his UFC career.
Yes, absolutely. That's like against Kung Lee, Wanderlei was just stalking, and as soon as Lee would throw, he would explode with a
and against Brian Stan, it was like Wanderlei jabbing and looking for counter right hands, not something you would have ever seen from him 5 years before.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's not an uncommon thing. I think it's a little surprising it took this long for Dan to come to terms with that and to go for it. But that's even something we've seen from Michael Bisping, too.
How do you mean?
More reliance on the counter. Like, he used to do a lot more kind of sticking and moving, coming in behind the jab, jab right hand, left hook, just 1, 2, 3, over and over and over again, kind of spamming those combinations. And now, like, he still does that, but he combines that with increased acumen as a counterpuncher too. Like,
very good point.
Bisping is a lot more comfortable letting you throw your shots at him and standing his ground and throwing back. So this makes Bisping a more effective outfighter, because you can't pressure him with the same kind of impunity that you used to. But it's also an expression of the same kind of thing, that as you get older, you see your opponent's shots better, right?
Yeah.
Like, you see them coming. You have a better understanding of spacing, distance, and timing, all of which are the necessary components of counterpunching.
Yeah, and there are certain things that experience can grant you the ability to do that can enhance a counterpunching game the way it may not enhance another. Like keeping your composure under duress a lot easier when you've been through it a lot of times. So more experienced fighters like Dan Henderson, like Anderson Silva, like Vanderlei Silva, they're not going to freak out the same way a young fighter might when somebody's coming after them. And so it becomes more comfortable to stand your ground, or even to find counters when you are being hurt, as Dan Henderson has several times in the last few years of his career. And then also, being able to play off of the opponent's emotions, like knowing how to get into a fighter's head, knowing how to draw them in. Those are things I think, those are the more intangible things, which are the reason I think counter-punching as a pure style is probably the rarest, because I think it really takes a subtle grasp of a lot of the mental gamesmanship and a certain kind of confidence and patience, and those are things that generally come with time. And so I think you probably, if we were to draw up a list right now, I can't say this for certain, but if we were to draw up like a roster of fighters of different styles, loosely put into one of 4 or 5 categories, I think you'd probably find that the counterpunchers are more often the oldest fighters, because there are guys who maybe have the talents to be effective counterpunchers and maybe counterpunch very well, but can't do it for long periods of time until they learn the patience and the calm that style requires. Let's take a quick break, Pat. When we come back, I will let you continue with whatever point you were just about to make, and we'll talk about Michael Bisping as well, because I think the relationship between him and Dan Henderson, as well as their relationship to a guy like Nate Marquardt, weirdly enough, all of these guys are middleweights, will be an interesting thing to discuss going forward, because they're all at very different points in their careers, but it's almost like looking at each of those fighters, we can see like a timeline. Each one falls into a different stage on the same kind of timeline of an old fighter. So we'll talk about that after this break. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And welcome back. We're going to talk a little bit about Michael Bisping in relation to guys like Dan Henderson and Nate Marquardt, the other 2 middleweights that are kind of in the discussion today. Maybe like Vitor Belfort too, is maybe Vitor is in the middle between those 2 groups. I'm not really sure where Vitor stands though, because I don't know about you, Pat, but to me, Vitor is a guy who like definitely benefited from TRT. And I think that totally changed his mindset to fighting. And I don't think he's as much physically declined as Dan Henderson is, but I think he is far more eroded in terms of confidence. I think he is back to the front runner blitzer that he was back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, I think we don't notice the physical drop-off as much because even 39-year-old Vitor Belfort with literally 20 years of MMA experience is still such a specimen. Like, sure, yeah. He's still, when he pulls the trigger, he is still so fucking fast.
He's the phenom, man. Well, so explosive. That's the thing, though. So is Dan Henderson. Not as quick to pull the trigger. I think his reaction time is slower, but the fast twitch muscles are still in place.
Oh, yeah. I mean, both of those guys have the explosiveness of dudes who have been on strength and conditioning programs since they were like 13 or 14 years old.
Sure.
Yeah. Which I think is true in Henderson's case. Like Henderson has been competing at a high level since he was like 14 or 15.
Was it you who told me that like Dan Henderson got a massage or something and he was like hurting the hands of his masseuse? Like somebody
said, me who said that, but I fundamentally believe it.
Somebody told me once that Dan Henderson, like somebody who did his physical therapist or someone said that it was like massaging a piece of wood. Like he is literally just completely hard all over his body.
Yeah, I have met his massage therapist. I believe that.
Oh, well, and the thing is I think there is maybe an argument to be made that like scientifically you are not even just going to, not that power is the last thing to go, but that you may get more and more powerful over time with those fast twitch explosive strikes and things like that, because it's been suggested to me by some trainers that there's muscle strength and there's tendon strength, and tendons take like 3 to 4 to 5 times as long as muscles to strengthen in the same way, and that perhaps over time your whole body catches up, and so that you're actually at your peak in terms of ability to generate power, but that, you know, the speed and the reflexes and those things go, and so you don't necessarily see it that much.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at like competitive power lifters and I think to a lesser extent Olympic lifters, which depends more on coordination and what have you, like they're all in their 30s or their 40s.
Sure, yeah.
You know, it's because it takes decades and decades to build that kind of strength up
Right.
from the baseline. So I think that that's possible. But with that said, I think that like the drop off in terms of raw speed and explosiveness has been more noticeable for Henderson than it has been for Belfort. But with that said,
Yeah.
Belfort still has dropped off noticeably even in the last 3 years. And whether you want to put that to him now being 39 or TRT or some combination of the lack of TRT or some combination of the two, like Belfort is not the guy he once was, and his confidence issues are go hand in hand with that.
Yeah,
Because
I think he hasn't had quite the physical drop off of Dan, but I think it has actually affected him mentally more. Dan Henderson rarely is like, he's not cowed by the fact that he's not fast enough. He just gets hit or he hits you. You know,
Yeah.
it's over it's over with him on top or it's over with you on top. It's not like he's ever breaking.
I mean, Belfort was the guy who, like, do you remember when Anderson pulled that thing with the mask at the weigh-ins?
Yeah.
So my old coach, who had trained with both of them back in the day, like we watched like a YouTube stream of that or something, and he turns to me and he's like, "Oh, Anderson just won the fight," like because Vitor can't deal with that. Vitor can't deal with any sort of cracks in his confidence at all, and so I think you're right that like when Vitor is feeling good, Vitor can maybe still do it, but it comes back to like these bursts and opportunities, right? And how many opportunities you can create for yourself and how many you can take advantage of. And if there's any hesitation at all, when you're a guy who's only going to get maybe 1 or 2 opportunities in the first round, you're sunk as a fighter. And I think that's where Vitor is. I expect Mousasi to do terrible things to him.
Yeah, me too. I mean, basically, we're talking, most of our discussion has kind of centered on the idea of all of these sliding scales, like how well you can create opportunities, how well you can capitalize on them, and then the whole sliding scale of where you are in terms of prime, where you have that nice intersection of enough athletic ability to take advantage of your skill and enough skill to be better than you ever have been before. I think I've had a lot of fun this week working on my Sherdog preview and everything, just kind of thinking in my head about the relationship between Michael Bisping and Dan Henderson and how they're not so different from one another in terms of career trajectories, and that I think Michael Bisping right now is where Dan Henderson was when he beat Michael Bisping. Like in that 2-year stretch after his win over Michael Bisping, we saw the best performances of Dan Henderson's career. We saw the win over Fedor Emelianenko. We saw a really impressive fight over a then surging Feijão, Rafael Cavalcante, and we saw that win over Bisping, of course. We almost saw him knock out Jake Shields. We saw a lot of good stuff from Dan where everything was really coming together, and I think it peaked at the point that he fought Michael Bisping. And that was Bisping Bisping was not comfortable at that time with a fighter like Dan Henderson. Now Bisping is where Henderson was then. Now we're seeing Bisping actually putting everything together, finding his confidence, finding his power, old enough that he has a lot of experience to lean on, and well-trained enough that he can turn that experience into skill, but not quite so old that his body is really failing him yet. At that time, in 2009, Henderson was probably not quite as quick on the trigger as he was when he was younger, but he was good enough to make up for it. I think that's where Bisping is right now. I think, like Dan was then, Bisping is the best Bisping we've ever seen at this moment.
Well, that's because he has the depth of technical skill necessary to play the kind of game that he wants to play as effectively as possible.
Yeah, and that's absolutely where Dan was when they fought. Like the level of the degree to which Dan Henderson set Michael Bisping up for that right hand heard round the world, you can look through that entire fight and see that thing coming in Dan's mind the entire way.
It's because he kept using his left hand to force his left hand and his left leg to force Bisping into the right hand. It's not like this was some masterpiece of like strategic thinking. Like this wasn't chess, this was checkers. But still, sometimes when you're out there playing checkers, you can win at that game.
Yeah, and like the Shogun fight, Dan was still quick enough on the reflexes that he actually wasn't bad defensively. He was fairly hard to hit cleanly. He was closing the distance quickly so that there were more openings and he was able to capitalize on them. But he was also experienced enough at that time that he knew exactly how to take advantage of what Bisping was doing. He wasn't just corralling him with his left hand. He was also, I think, getting him to look for that jab after the inside kick. I think he was using the left hook off the jab. I think he spent the first round and a half of that fight very thoroughly conditioning Michael Bisping to only be worried about his left hand, despite what everyone knew about Dan Henderson, which is that his right hand was his biggest weapon. He spent that fight.
The 30 seconds before he landed the knockout shot are a masterpiece of setup for that, because it wasn't just what he did in the 5 seconds before it that set up the right hand. It was a whole series of things that he did to open that up, to put Bisping to put Bisping at the right range for it, at the right angle for it, to circle him into it, to have him in the right spot in the cage to eat that right hand.
Yeah.
Like, it was all perfect setup for it.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't complex stuff, but it was basic and it was perfectly executed.
Yeah, and it was fundamentally sound. It was a very solid performance from Dan Henderson. Everything was in its place. And, I mean, I don't know what does a really good performance that's really complex look like. Like when it comes down to it, most of the best performances of all time in combat sports are when somebody just executes fundamental things really well. And they have enough commitment to those fundamentals to do them really well. Guys who get older and think that means they have like more crazy techniques they can throw, that's like Joshua Berkman. That's not somebody who's actually really getting better. Then there are guys like Dan Henderson who get older and they maybe reduce what they rely on, but it's because they know how fully they can rely on those skills. Floyd Mayweather was the same way as a boxer. The way that he attacked, the number of punches he threw, the types of punches he threw, way smaller in the last few years of his career than they were when he was beating.
Let's not go overboard with what Dan Henderson did to set that up here. I mean, like, it was effective, but this was not like executing a pressure game plan against a really skilled outsider. That would be a complex game.
It was perfect for Bisping. But that's the thing, is the reason it worked is because Bisping there was not Bisping now. Like, if that Bisping fought that Dan Henderson, I think he would probably win, or at least it would be a lot more competitive.
Okay, so what does Bisping do better now than he did then? Let's break this down.
Yeah, okay. Well, Bisping now, I think the biggest thing you can say about Bisping now is that he sets his feet. It doesn't stand around and stand his ground all the time. He's not flat-footed. He still moves really well. But we did a commentary on that fight, Pat. We did our UFC 100 commentary prior to UFC 200. And I think we were both immediately struck by how different Bisping's movement looked. He was twinkle toes to the extreme. He could not settle down, and he to the degree that he was pulling his punches because he was so worried about getting quickly out of range, and in being so anxious about it, being so anxious about not being close enough for Dan to hit him or for Dan to take him down, he was not planted well enough to actually nail Dan with the shots that he was throwing, and B, not actually well positioned when he was pulling away to absorb a shot. His feet were not in fundamentally good position constantly, and now they are.
There was a lot of movement for the sake of movement.
Yes.
Like, there was a lot of a sense that I'm supposed to be an in and out kind of out fighter.
Yes.
I'm supposed to work behind. I'm supposed to throw jabs. I'm supposed to throw low kicks. I'm supposed to throw a right hand. I'm supposed to get in on one line and then I'm supposed to get out on another.
Yeah.
It was very rote. Really, really rote kind of thing, in a sense that I'm doing this because I'm supposed to be doing this, rather than there being an organic kind of reaction to what he was seeing in the cage.
Yeah.
So the ideas were, okay, I'm durable. I work at a really quick pace, and I'm going to just wear this guy out with my feet and with the strikes that I'm throwing. And that's still what Bisping wants to do now, but he's so much more effective at it. Like, it's amazing to watch how much better he is at this now, because it's not like he's doing tremendously complicated things. Like, he throws an occasional spinning kick and he throws a really nice left kick to the body, but his arsenal is basically the same as it was. Mm-hmm. It's just that his footwork is so much better that it allows him to stay closer, and it allows him to stay defensively sound. He can keep an even quicker pace, without having to do these big kind of leaping in, leaping out movements, without compromising himself defensively, without walking himself into the kinds of counter shots he used to eat regularly.
Yeah, and I think it allows him to hit harder too. I think he's absolutely more heavy-handed than he ever was. Bisping had a reputation as a pillow-fisted fighter. That was always the phrase that got thrown around. And then it kind of became popular to say, well, he doesn't hit hard because he's trying to avoid takedowns. And so people ran with that. They kind of rationalized it like, oh yeah, like that's the trade-off. If you don't want to get hit with takedowns, you never ever set your feet. And now Bisping has found the balance between those two ideas. He's still not easy to take down or track down with strikes, but because he's more settled, he's in a better position to either evade or follow up with an attack of his own. I think Bisping, for many years there, when he had his reputation as the pillow-fisted guy, when he was fighting guys like Akiyama and when he was fighting like Chael Sonnen and, Vanderlei Silva the first time around, only time around, sorry, I don't know what I'm thinking there, that we were seeing this guy who was getting hit hard and couldn't hit hard in return. And then recently, we have had 3 fights now where Bisping, if we go back through his past 6 fights, there's 4 fights where he has hurt his opponent pretty badly at some point in the fight, if not finished them. Knocking out Luke Rockhold, dropping Anderson Silva twice, dropping CB Dalloway, and knocking out Kung Lee. I think he's a lot more effective now at making those shots count. And like you said, I'm glad you said he's not doing anything complex, because that's why I think it's so funny these two are meeting now. Because Michael Bisping now is exactly where Dan Henderson was when Dan Henderson beat him before. Nothing is complex, but he knows exactly why he's doing what he's doing at any given moment.
Yeah, like the other big addition to Bisping's game, I think, is he like part of not having great footwork and feeling like he was constantly supposed to be moving was that he panicked a little bit when he got pressured.
Yeah.
And we saw this. I think the clearest example of this to me was in the Chael Sonnen fight, which a lot of people now remember as like as a robbery that Bisping clearly won that fight and Sonnen got a gift decision. That's bullshit. Go back and watch that fight. It was it was very close. If you want to say that Bisping won it, I'm not going to get real mad at you, but it was not a robbery by any stretch of the imagination.
It was a divisive fight, but
Bisping spent most of the fight with his back shoved up against the fence. Why was that? Because he panicked and tried to and didn't have an answer when Sonnen pressured him.
Right.
Classic pressure fighter move. He just kind of came straight at him, cut off his angles, and Bisping had nowhere to go. Now, if you try and pressure Bisping, Bisping has a couple of different answers. He can stand his ground, plant his feet, and throw at you in the pocket. He's happy to exchange intelligently. But he also has much better tight quarters footwork, much better pivots, much better small steps, much better side steps, all of which allow him to keep his back off the fence in the first place. So it's much harder to force Bisping out of the kind of fight that he wants to be in these days.
Well, look at the Luke Rockhold fight, the most recent one. Rockhold spent a lot of that fight, especially the latter half of that round when just before he was knocked out, coming after Bisping, walking him down, keeping him on the end of his strikes. And there was no point at which Bisping did what so many MMA fighters do. He didn't turn his back and run at any point. He didn't jog away to create space. He was always facing Rockhold. He was always ready to fire back. And he was, in fact, often controlling Rockhold's hands while he came forward and checking him so that he made sure he was as difficult to hit as possible while still well-positioned enough to safely get back to the space that he wanted. That fight, again, I think that was his UFC 100 performance that Dan Henderson had, because everything was in its place. It was not like nothing about the performance was like mind-blowing in its complexity, but everything about it was really smart. And we talked a lot about that fight before it happened, that basically because he's not a powerful fighter, Michael Bisping is going to have to fight a perfect fight to beat Luke Rockhold. And he, maybe didn't fight a perfect fight. It was pretty even up until the point when he hurt Luke Rockhold. And he didn't necessarily need to, because he knocked Luke Rockhold out, but he was fighting a really solid fight the whole way. The whole thing was competitive. At no point was it like Luke Rockhold's easily winning this. It was Luke Rockhold has to be careful of what Michael Bisping's throwing back at him. Michael Bisping has to be careful of what Luke Rockhold is coming at him with. It was, which is a lot, I think, saying a lot for how much we agreed beforehand, how overmatched Bisping was athletically by Rockhold.
Yeah, I mean, it was, despite the fact that it only lasted for a round, it was the perfect fight for him. And it was the culmination of everything that Bisping had been working on. Like, it was crazy how many sequences there were in that fight that looked exactly like sequences from the Anderson Silva fight. Exactly like it, especially when Anderson got to pressuring him. There's a sequence that look there. You put them side by side from the Silva fight and from the Rockhold fight that look exactly identical in terms of the strikes that Silva and Rockhold entered with, and the way that Bisping countered them, exactly identical.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So, yeah, it's like there's, again, not complicated stuff, meat and potatoes boxing, but that's Jason Perillo. That's what makes him a fantastic striking.
Shout out to Jason Perillo, especially because Jason Perillo predicted a left hook knockout. He turned Michael Bisping from the count into a left hook Larry, as Michael Bisping himself so proudly said after that knockout, and which is a thing that I desperately don't want to go away. I want Michael Bisping to be known as left hook Larry. I need that to happen, Pat.
Yeah, I like it. Well, so should we take a little break and then come back for one more segment?
Yeah, when we come back, how about this? We're going to talk a little bit about what's going on, what went on last week, and then a couple of the other fights taking place at UFC 204, kind of a mixed bag fight smorgasbord kind of thing after this break. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back. First up on the docket for our fight smorgasbord, let's talk about the main card opener featherweight matchup between Mirsad Bektic. He's been out for quite some time, I think about a year and a half now, recovering from an ACL injury. And he is now fighting the third opponent that has been lined up for him, Russell Doane. Before Russell Doane, it was Jeremy Kennedy, who was
for all of one day before Kennedy pulled out with an injury.
Yeah, Kennedy injured himself, basically went into the gym to prepare for Mirsad Bektic and immediately hurt himself. And Kennedy was a replacement for Arnold Allen, a top English prospect. And so now we get Russell Doane, one of the few featherweights crazy enough to step up against a top prospect on short notice. The interesting question here, Pat, is how does Mirsad Bektic look after a long layoff? How does a style like his deal with something as devastating as an ACL injury?
Well, I think it's possible that it's going to be that it could be a real problem because your ACL affects the stability of your knee. It affects your ability to plant and explode, and that is very much Mirsad Bektic's style. Mm-hmm. With that said, it doesn't sound like this was a terrible ACL injury. He suffered the injury, I think, last November. So that means he had surgery. He was out for a few months. He did probably 3-4 months of physical therapy, and then he was back to training over the summer.
He was cleared to train in August, I believe.
Yeah, so this was not the worst case scenario ACL injury at this point, unless your body rejects the graft. Wherever you're getting the graft from, mm-hmm. You're in pretty good shape with an ACL injury.
And I suppose it's a pretty good sign that he was not cleared to train until August, and that basically is 2 months ago. So what that means is he was cleared to train, and like right when they said he was okay to train, he made it through a full camp.
Yeah, exactly. He's a young guy. He's only 25.
Yeah.
So that speaks well to his ability to recover from this. If he were 33 and this were his first blown knee, he might be in trouble. But I'm inclined to think it won't be a huge issue for him, especially because he's so explosive to start with.
Yeah.
Like, I think he's got a little bit to spare, you know what I mean?
Yeah, he's where McGregor was when McGregor hurt his knee.
Yeah, except he is way more of a physical specimen than Conor McGregor.
You think so?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Bektic is one of the very best athletes I've ever seen in an MMA fight. I don't think McGregor is anywhere close to that in terms of raw explosiveness and athleticism. No way.
Yeah, and Bektic, while not being as powerful as McGregor, I think he does have a style that benefits more from having that just kind of raw physicality, being a well-rounder, but one who really specializes in taking his opponents down and beating them up while they desperately try to transition underneath him.
Yeah, I can't overstate how physically imposing Bektic is in a cage. He is, I say this without exaggeration, at least before the ACL injury, Bektic is like young GSP relative to his competition in terms of how much more athletically gifted he is. Lucas Martins is an athletic guy. Bektic made him look like he was standing still. and made it like Martins is not like a small dude or a weak guy. Like Martins is a physically imposing featherweight, and Bektic just blasted him.
Yeah.
Absolutely blasted him. Like
I actually think I have in my head made the GSP comparison many times and held back from saying it because I know people that seems like a little too much to say right now. But honestly, like Bektic it's very tough to call someone's potential this early in their career and say this is where they're going to go. Any number of things can happen, but Bektic is like a young GSP with without confidence issues, which is really good. Like that gives you a huge amount of potential to rocket through a division and become something very quickly.
Well, he's 25 years old. He's been training at ATT since he was 18 or 19. He walked into the gym on his first day as an amateur fighter and apparently gave a good account of himself sparring with Mike Thomas Brown, who was at that point, I think, prepping for. I think he was prepping for like his last fight in the WEC. He's like Jason High. When I talked to him about Mirsad, said he was, quote, a freak. Like he's spent his entire professional career training in that environment, surrounded by elite professional fighters. He's a specimen. He's huge. He's strong. He's really fast. He's really explosive. He understands, like, the GSP comparison doesn't come from the physicality. It comes from his understanding of how to blend his skill sets together.
Plus the physicality, like in addition to it.
Yeah. So like, it's not just that he can blast you off your feet with a double leg. It's that he understands how to bait you into such a position that he's already on your hips anyway.
Yeah. And yet he's way more aggressive in the process.
Yeah. Oh, he is a killer. Maybe it comes from having grown up in like a Bosnian refugee camp.
Maybe.
But like he has serious killer instinct. Like he throws ground strikes with the energy and demeanor of a particularly angry jackhammer.
Sure, of jackhammer on a bad day. So, Pat, you said before, though, that you think with this injury, this matchup strikes you as the kind where maybe Doan will piece Mirsad Bektic up a little bit before Bektic kind of recovers from the ring rust?
Yeah, I think Bektic's weakest skill set is still his striking. I think he's very good, and I think he has the right ideas about a lot of things, but I don't think he's gotten a lot of cage time in terms of just striking. What we've seen from him has been very good and very promising, with the exception, I think, of his debut against Chaz Skelly. It still looked like he was trying to figure out what was going on there, but he'd only been fighting for about 2.5 years at that point.
I think he's kind of in the Gilbert Burns position, where like you give him someone maybe like Łukasz Sajewski and he can look pretty solid. But if you were to put Mirsad Bektic in there right now with an Aldo or a Holloway, he would get destroyed on the feet. Like I just think he's just not that comfortable there yet, and he's only been granted the ability to look really comfortable because the guys he's striking effectively with are cowed by his aggression and his takedown threat.
Yeah, well, in his physicality.
Sure,
It's one thing because Lucas Martins is a pretty skilled striker. But when you put him in there, a guy who is used to being the faster guy, and he's pretty clearly not, like that's going to mess with your head going to mess with your head pretty substantially.
So I mean, he being this undefeated fighter, this kind of athletic force of nature right now, he typically has a confidence advantage. But if you were to take his skill set right now and match it with someone who is experienced enough or skilled enough not to feel threatened by that, he probably wouldn't look quite as good.
Yeah, and so for this fight, I kind of expect to see Bektic get hit quite a bit in the first minute or so because Doan tends to come out hot. We've seen that from him in his last couple of fights. Come out real hot, throws a lot of volume early. Like I think he threw 20 strikes in the first minute against Pedro Munoz, and then like 22 the second minute of the fight.
He looked really good in that fight, actually. Yeah,
he looked really good, and he was fast at bantamweight. He's going to be faster at featherweight. Like I kind of expect him to land cleanly, especially if Bektic comes out of the gate a little rusty, which I don't think would be unreasonable to expect. But Doan doesn't have like bulletproof takedown defense even against bantamweights. So I think the second that Bektic gets his hands on him, he's going to take him down and just flatten him.
It's not a great sign that you're fighting Bektic after losing to Gerard Sanders.
Yeah, that is a recipe for saying that you're going to spend a lot of time on your back, especially because unlike Sanders, Bektic's takedown defense is bulletproof. If a guy is going to take him down, it's not going to be Russell Doan.
So what we're saying here, Pat, basically what you're saying is that in 3 years, it's very, very likely that there will be a back and forth war at the top of this division between Mirsad Bektic and Max Holloway for the title. Our two favorite featherweight prospects.
Yeah, I would not at all. I would kind of be surprised if Bektic did not fight for a title. Like you said, there's a lot that can go wrong, but like I've watched a lot of prospects over the years, like a lot of prospects, and Bektic is the most gifted guy I've ever watched.
Yeah.
So, not necessarily the best prospect. I think that's still. I think Tom Duquesnoy is up there. I think Chris Weidman was up there. Luke Rockhold too was up there. But I think in terms of sheer giftedness, Bektic takes the top of the
sheer
list.
physicality. Yeah. All right. So the other one we wanted to talk about from that is about to take place at UFC 204 was welterweight battle, the first preliminary fight on Fox Sports 1 between Leon Edwards and Albert Tumenov. Fans of the show will well know that we are fans of Einstein, of Albert Tumenov. To the point that I think we quite blindly picked him over Gunnar Nelson, really expecting that fight to go better than it did, and he really didn't look that great. He had a tough time, and I think putting that together with some of his other fights, we've seen some of what Tumenov struggles with and some of what he needs to work on. Fortunately, he is still very young. He's only 24 years old and has already had great results, so you can expect improvements, but you can say the same things about Leon Edwards, who is similarly a dedicated striker for the most part, and just 25 years old. And so both of these guys probably have pretty bright futures. Tumenov has been more successful than Edwards thus far, but I also think they've kind of been matching Tumenov with strikers, and they've been matching Edwards almost exclusively with people who want to take him down. And so maybe that explains some of the difference in their results. What do you think, Pat?
So I went back and kind of reevaluated that Nelson fight, and I think that the first minute or so was ugly, and then after that, I was pretty surprised at how well Tumenov did. The problem was the takedowns, and I think our flaw in analyzing that fight beforehand was we didn't see the improvements that Nelson made going into it. Like, Nelson had never looked that good blending his strikes and his takedowns together. Never looked that good with it.
I think also maybe I discounted just the wrestling skill that he has. I basically saw him with like Rick Story and like, look how easily he's being outstruck, and didn't take into account how much Story's wrestling, how much a role Story's wrestling played in the ability to outstrike Nelson. Because with the takedown threat, he was also somewhat successful landing awkward strikes on Tumenov at long range.
Yeah, he absolutely was. But I think like once, like what was striking to me in rewatching that was a lot of the focus was on, oh my God, Nelson is landing these surprising strikes. Tumenov like substantially outlanded him at range in that fight.
Body shots in particular.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people, like I learned this after the Lineker-Dodson fight last weekend, I think a lot of people just don't score body shots. Like they just don't think that body punches count.
You know what the craziest thing is? What was I watching on that card that gave me that impression? It was Berkman versus Otto. Berkman landed 2 body kicks, because body kicks are the ones that always catch people's attention because they look so big. Berkman lands 2 body kicks on Zach Otto's elbows and arms, and they make a big slap, and both of them get this big noise from the crowd, and then Otto plugs him under the elbow, a virtually silent kick with evident force behind it, right to the midsection, and you don't hear a peep from the crowd. I don't think that when body shots are really effective, people notice them. I think it's just body kicks, things that are showy to the body, maybe like a spinning back kick, but the average body shot that lands cleanly, it doesn't usually garner a big effect from the opponent unless you have a great penetrative shot and you hit an internal organ. It doesn't tend to make a big sound. It's all just about digging into a target that doesn't move when you hit it. So
I think especially with MMA gloves on, is like at least with boxing gloves, you see the hand move. You know?
Yeah.
Like it looks much more visually impressive when you're wearing boxing gloves. When you're wearing MMA gloves, like Tumenov was consistently slipping in a left hook to the liver. He had Nelson's body all marked up.
Yeah.
Like my evaluation of this fight has changed substantially since I watched it. Like I watched it and I was pretty disappointed in Tumenov. I went back and I watched it again and I'm like, holy shit, Nelson did some amazing things with his transitions and his chain wrestling.
Yeah.
Like that was my takeaway from that fight. Now, more than like there is a substantial problem with Tumenov's game. I thought he looked quick. I thought he looked effective. I thought he had the right game plan. But when he got onto the ground, he just didn't have any answers for Nelson.
So to me, it's actually the defense and the way that Tumenov felt he had to attack to get at Nelson that's more worrying than the takedowns that Nelson landed and how easily he outworked him on the ground. Because I think we both agree there's little chance of that happening in this fight. I think Tumanov's probably a little more physically strong than Leon Edwards, and Edwards is not as good a wrestler as Gunnar Nelson, nor is he as good on the ground. Tumanov himself is normally a very good scrambler, too, and not a bad wrestler in his own right. So what worried me about Tumanov going forward is that it kind of, some of the problems he had seemed to kind of fall in line with problems he had in previous fights. I know you didn't think it was particularly close, but I was a little worried by his fight with Lorenz Larkin. I don't think it's good for any fighter to just be willingly absorbing that many strikes, even if they're maybe not ones that people score as highly as clean shots to the head and body. And he had a little bit of difficulty too in his fight with Nico Muzoke before adjusting and taking over that fight in the second and third rounds. He was a little hittable. And so I'm kind of wondering going forward if Tumanov is maybe going to have a similar issue to like a guy like Tamden McCrory, who's really good in mid-range, or like a Patricky Pitbull type maybe, like very good and dangerous in mid-range. Has that great transition ability. He can open up his combinations as the range separates, but getting to that range is going to be a problem for him. He's a little slow-footed. He's a bit of a plotter, I think, and has to kind of leap across that space to get at somebody who is electing to fight from a long distance.
Yeah, I can see that being a problem for him, especially because like you said, he's not that big. He's not that fast. He looks faster than he is because he has good timing.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that could be the case. I think that Tumanov's future, more than anything else, is going to be as a counterpuncher. Like, I think that he is less effective when he's trying to go after his opponent than he is when he's letting his opponent come to him and letting his opponent cover that distance for him.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see what happens, because I think he can always use that really good clean jab that he has as a way of opening up that counter game. So we'll see, and a way of scoring, because that's kind of the problem if you want to be a counter puncher, is you still got to have ways of scoring points.
Yeah. Well, I'm actually riding with Leon Edwards in this fight. Just kind of a chance pick, but I'm going to go based on the notion that Tumanov, for the time being, struggles with guys who pick and choose their shots from long distance, that his only solution to that is to really cover that distance quickly with a big power shot, a strike to the body. That can be a good way to elect to strike, but I'm quite curious to see how Edwards will look against someone who isn't really going to threaten him with takedowns that much. And I have a feeling he's going to look a lot more comfortable with his striking. Although he could be like a Joanna Jędrzejczyk, where we expected her to blow up Valerie Letourneau because she wouldn't have to worry about takedowns. And it turned out that, she had to kind of adjust to a fighter who wasn't just trying to constantly take her down.
Yeah, I mean, I've been big on Edwards for a while, but I think the problem, like, even looking back at his pre-UFC fights, the problem, he has struggled to really produce a lot of offense in the UFC. Mm-hmm. And that was but that was a problem for him beforehand too. Even when guys weren't actively going after taking him down, he was a guy who was always looking for the right shot, mm-hmm. rather than just scoring. And I don't think that he's overcome those instincts. Whereas Tumanov is a guy who's happy to go out there and just land shots. Land shots. They don't have to be the perfect shots. They just have to be good shots. And that's the difference between winning rounds and losing rounds. Sure. So that's kind of what I see happening here.
Yeah, I think that's a fair call. Then let's quickly wrap up here and talk about the one fight, I suppose, that most interested us from UFC Portland, was it? And I'm talking, of course, about the main event, a catchweight fight between John Lineker and John Dodson. Is it a little strange to you, Pat, that fans are way more forgiving of John Lineker's missing weight for the fifth time in a new division than they are of Alex Oliveira missing weight for the first time? I know Oliveira was disrespectful after missing weight. I know it was a much bigger differential, but John Lineker isn't supposed to have this problem anymore at bantamweight, and it's the fifth time in like 10 UFC fights. It's a little frustrating. He's
on that rumble weight plan.
Yeah.
Like, I just remember Lineker saying before the fight in one of the hype packages, like, I think I'm ready to be at the top of this division, blah blah blah, or the ready to be at the top of my division. I'm like, man, you got to pick a division.
Yeah,
you gotta pick
he's like, I want to
stick with it.
He said it after the win. He's like, I want a shot at the title. It's like, dude, you can't make weight. Like, you're
there is no 136.5 pound title for you to fight for.
Hell
like,
no.
This isn't boxing.
The UFC does not want another Silva Lutter situation where they have to have a non-title bout with the champion not defending. Nobody wants to see that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this fight played out pretty much exactly how I thought it would. Like, It's rare that happens. but this happened almost exactly the way I thought it would. Like, I don't get anybody who calls this a robbery. I don't see that. I think it was a close fight. I understand why the judges scored it the way they did. I think Dodson landed cleaner headshots. I think Lineker landed the better overall volume. And I think that in that kind of fight, like, the appearance of activity matters a very great deal. And Lineker threw like 120 more strikes over 5 rounds than Dodson did.
Yeah.
He threw like 5 more strikes a minute. And like, whether they're landing or not, if you're controlling where in the cage the action is taking place, which by and large Lineker was through his pressure game, if you're producing the more memorable bursts of offense and you're generally throwing more, like, the judges are going to score that stuff. Like, I don't know how anybody could be surprised that that was the outcome.
Yeah. Yeah, I felt I had, honestly, I'm kind of waiting for updated fight metric stats to come out. I'm not sure I really buy that John Dodson outlanded Lineker as much as the statistics seem to say. I haven't watched the fight like slowed down and counted them like Fight Metric will have eventually done when they come up with their concrete stats. But it didn't really feel to me watching live that Dodson was outlanding Lineker. It felt like Lineker was getting home with a lot of body shots and was catching Dodson with cuffing shots on the way out. I will say, however, to amend what you said about it going exactly as you expected, it was kind of that way for me. I was more impressed with Dodson than I expected to be. And I guess that's because I was impressed with Dodson at all, because we had our little hate fest about John Dodson on last week's episode. As a fighter who's always frustrated me, I thought he did a pretty good job of sticking to a game plan. He was, he didn't let Lineker lull him into a firefight despite Lineker's best efforts. I thought there was a point in that fight when Lineker started to mock him and try to goad him in, that Lineker was going to start fading and Dodson might start taking over. And to Lineker's credit, he is insanely durable because he took so many clean shots with no effect whatsoever. Didn't ever once look staggered, even from head kicks and perfect straight lefts down the middle. And he just kept coming forward. His conditioning was good. It looked like he reserved a little bit of energy in the early rounds. So both guys fought maybe a little smarter than I would have expected them to, but I was more surprised with Dodson because he made this fight really, really close, and I thought it would be the kind of fight where he wouldn't be able to resist the fight that Lineker wanted to force him into.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I really thought it was the best strategic performance of both guys' careers by a really long stretch. And maybe that's just because we haven't seen Dodson in 5-round fights with anybody other than Demetrius Johnson.
Yeah.
Like, maybe that's kind of the issue. And this is the first time we've seen Lineker in a 5-round fight that went past the opening frame.
Yeah.
So,
and maybe John Dodson deserves to join our discussion as an old man fighter because he's only 32, but that's old for a bantamweight, and he's been fighting professionally since 2004.
Yeah, he's got like 12 and a half years of experience under his belt. So,
and that was
that
was a crafty veteran's performance.
Yeah, it really was. I mean, I was really impressed by Dodson's ability to stick to that plan and not to freelance, which has been a problem for him before.
Totally.
He even produced a higher volume of strikes than he has
a
lot of the time.
Yeah, like the whole thing, he was sticking and moving the way you're supposed to. He made his counters count. He was actually staying fairly busy when he was moving. I personally don't really get people criticizing him for running. He did a lot of evasive movement. Not all of it was perfect or technical, but it's John Dodson. I thought he did a good job of staying busy. I didn't think he ever looked like he completely wanted to avoid the fight. He just wanted it to be the kind of fight that he came in trying to have.
Yeah, I think there were some puzzling decisions about the directionality of movement from him. I think, I was surprised that he spent as much time circling into Lineker's right hand as he did.
Typically you see that from people with a good jab or fighters, southpaws who are really confident with their head movement and counter lefts from that inside angle. And Dodson didn't really have that. So I'm not sure why. Often the conventional wisdom that you always move away from the power hand is only true if you don't know how to use your angles. But Dodson didn't really know how to use that angle. It didn't seem so.
Well, he did land some really good shots from the inside angle, and he landed some good shots over the top of Lineker's right hand. But he also kind of lost himself the fight by walking into into the right hook to the body.
Yeah.
I think more than anything else, that's what started. Dodson was handily winning the 4th round, very handily winning the 4th round until he walked into 2 of those right hooks right to the body right in a row. It was a lapse in judgment, or he'd been hit enough times to the body that he was kind of that he wasn't quite on the ball anymore.
But all of a
sudden, that's what started that flurry.
Yeah, it's a great shot for pressure fighters. Like all through the annals of boxing history, pressure fighters have been using that wide right to the body. It's how Ken Norton beat Muhammad Ali. It's how George Foreman beat Joe Frazier. And people are still using it well today. And Lineker prefers his hands to his kicks. Can't fault him for that. The guy's pretty heavy-handed. That wide right to the body is like he picked his shots very well. Not only in how many he threw, but in what he targeted to control what was almost certainly the fastest and flightiest opponent he's ever fought.
True. So I was looking at the fight metric stats, and I think I have the answer to your question, Connor.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the shots that you're thinking of, a lot of Lineker's headshots were partially deflected and thus weren't scored. So to me, they look like, thinking about them live, I thought, oh, that was a great flurry. Went back and watched it again. They were partially deflected, didn't cleanly land, bounced off of Lineker's shoulder, or bounced off of Dodson's shoulder first. So those are still shots that matter in the way that I score the fight, but they are not necessarily shots that Fight Metric is going to score as landed shots. Does that make sense?
To me, that it would seem like they should maybe score those as non-significant strikes, but still score them as strikes. The numbers seem to suggest that they didn't score them at all.
They didn't score them at all.
And to me,
the same way that they don't score a blocked body kick.
Well, nor should they. I mean, a blocked body, I think it should land on a scoring target, but a kick that is partially blocked but which still sneaks under the elbow a bit is a lot different to me than a kick that is fully on the arm. Like, they both have an effect. There is certainly value in landing a hard kick to an opponent's block, but to me that doesn't score. Whereas a partially blocked blow does score. I think glancing blows should score. So, difference of opinion, though. That's all it is. It does say, I mean,
they have their set criteria for what counts as a landed strike and what doesn't, and I would rather that they stuck to that as a consistent thing, because then even if the methodology is flawed, it's at least consistently flawed.
Yeah, they should definitely stick to the rules. I don't think I've ever noticed that. I've never really had that feeling looking at Fight Metric stats before, where I was like, no way, these numbers feel off to me. And they do. But I think that's a good point. I think I probably know why now. So good performance from both guys. No reason to think that John Lineker should get a title shot anytime soon, unfortunately, because it was the kind of performance that I'm sure the brass would love to give him a title shot off of. And good showing from John Dodson. I don't ever expect to go into a John Dodson fight feeling pleased with it. This is a fight I would definitely watch again. I would watch it again and enjoy both guys' work. So I have no complaints really whatsoever. And with that, I think we end today's show. Pat, before we go out to get out of here, do you want to tell the people what you've got coming out this week?
As of last Friday, new episode of the Fall of Rome podcast, looking at the catastrophic fall of Roman Britain, how we went from a place that was a functional, urbanized part of the Roman world to something completely different in just 150 years. That's one thing. This week, I've got a preview of UFC 204. I will have a piece on Michael Bisping up on the Washington Post. I will be doing play-by-play for the Washington Post on Saturday night. So If you're going to be watching the fights, go ahead and follow along with me. I'll be doing live technical analysis. And then I will probably have something else this week up on Bleacher Report. I haven't the foggiest idea what, though.
You are a very prolific man, Patrick Wyman. Am I the only person who thought that Londinium was a made-up word for a long time? I thought it was like a made-up, jokey way of saying London and making it sound fancier. It doesn't sound like... It sounds like made-up Latin.
Well, it's actually derived from whatever the underlying British word was, if memory serves correctly.
It's a Latinization of a British word.
Yeah, I think so. Same like I believe Eboracum also, which is York.
Do you know how Lewis Carroll got his pen name?
No,
Lewis Carroll's... Let's see. His real name was Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, and he took the names Charles Lutwidge, loosely Romanized them to Carolus Ludovicus, then loosely re-anglicized them and changed their order, which is how he got Lewis Carroll. So there you go. The process of Roman and Anglicization at work. I don't know. Maybe I should do that Jeopardy test, Pat.
Dude, do it. Do it. For those of our listeners who are into this sort of thing, Jeopardy online tests this week, if you're interested in being on Jeopardy. Just throwing that out there.
Eligibility. I cannot talk today, my God. As for me, Pat, still working on videos. I have in works right now a lot of videos on Kovalev versus Ward, which is happening in November. I want to start getting those out soon. and I love that fight so much. It's the first fight in boxing for quite some time that I've really gotten excited about, so I'm really looking forward to that. And also just working on stuff with Henderson Bisping. I think I may do a look back at Henderson's fight with Shogun, kind of commemorating his last great performance, the sort of at the end of an era of Henderson as a top fighter, and possibly the fight that made him no longer a top fighter, because as we said, it was such a brutal contest. And something else, Sherdog preview of UFC 204 as well. Otherwise, I think that's about it. So with nothing else to discuss, find us on social media. Patrick is at Patrick_Wyman. I am at Boxing Bush. That's BUSCH. And we will talk to you guys next time. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been another episode of Heavy Hands.